The market was alive with its usual chaos, a cacophony of voices calling out prices, the clatter of crates being stacked, and the mingling scents of fresh vegetables, ripe fruits, and exotic spices. I wandered through the narrow aisles with a list half formed in my mind, more distracted by the hum of activity than any real focus on shopping. It was then that I saw her. She stood behind a small stall, arranging neatly stacked oranges with careful, deliberate hands. She was older than most of the women around, maybe in her early 40s, I guessed, but there was a poise about her that made her stand out. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands brushing gently against her face, and she wore a light scarf that framed her features with understated elegance. There was something about the way she moved, graceful yet unhurried, that made me pause, though I didn't understand why. For a moment, our eyes met across the bustling aisle. There was no dramatic flair, no exaggerated gesture, just a quiet acknowledgement that we had noticed each other. Her gaze held mine a second longer than necessary, curious, observant, maybe even amused. I felt my chest tighten slightly, a fluttering that had nothing to do with the market and everything to do with her presence. She smiled then, not a broad, performative smile, but a small, gentle curve of her lips that seemed almost private, as if she were smiling at some thought I couldn't see. I caught a faint whiff of her perfume as the wind shifted, something warm, floral, slightly sweet. It wasn't overpowering. It was enough to linger in my memory after she had turned away to assist a child picking out apples. That brief act of kindness, the way she knelt slightly to chat with the little boy, adjusting his hat with careful fingers, revealed a softness that contrasted with her otherwise composed exterior. I found myself slowing my pace, stealing glances as I navigated the crowded aisles. There was an unusual pull toward her, an unexplainable desire to linger, even if only from afar. I wasn't normally the type to be captivated by strangers in passing, but there was something in her stillness amid the chaos, a quiet confidence, that demanded attention. As I approached the end of the stall, I noticed her eyes again. This time, she seemed almost aware of my hesitancy, her lips curling in that same gentle smile. She made a subtle adjustment to her basket, tilting it just enough that our eyes met once more. In that fleeting moment, I felt an odd sense of recognition, as though we existed in the same bubble, removed from the bustle around us, even if only for a heartbeat. I walked past her then, telling myself it was absurd to be so affected by a brief glance. Yet as I continued down the aisle, I realized the sensation hadn't faded. Her presence, the quiet warmth of her attention, had marked me in a way that I couldn't ignore. It was as if the market itself had slowed around her, leaving only the hum of life and the subtle, magnetic pull of someone I was only beginning to notice, but already unable to forget. I thought the moment at her stall was just a fleeting encounter, a brief, almost imperceptible connection that would dissolve as soon as I walked away. Yet, as I exited the crowded aisles of the market and stepped onto the sun-warmed cobblestones, I became aware of a subtle rhythm behind me. At first I thought it was merely my imagination, the shuffle of feet, the occasional clink of a crate, the rustle of fabric as shoppers moved past. But then I noticed it more clearly, a gentle, steady pace that seemed to mirror my own. Curiosity prickled at me, tinged with unease. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to be casual, and saw her, not close, not intrusively near, but walking a few steps behind, as though ensuring I wasn't lost in the crowd. She wore a lightweight cardigan over her blouse, and the sunlight caught the strands of her hair, turning them into a subtle halo. She carried herself with the same calm confidence I'd noticed earlier, yet now there was an added attentiveness, a sense of watchfulness that made my chest tighten. I quickened my pace slightly, unsure why I felt compelled to do so. The market had thinned a little, the vendors packing up for the afternoon, and the scent of warm bread from a nearby bakery mingled with the sharp tang of fresh citrus. Her presence behind me was like a quiet warmth I couldn't quite place, not threatening, but strangely comforting. My thoughts were a jumble. Who was she? Why was she following me? And yet, beneath it all, there was a curious thrill. When I reached a narrow corner where the cobblestones were slick from an earlier drizzle, my foot slipped slightly. Before I could steady myself, a firm, yet gentle hand was on my elbow. I froze, startled, and then realized it was her. She had moved closer, not hurriedly, but with a deliberate ease. "The path ahead is slippery," she said softly, her voice carrying that calm, understated concern I had glimpsed at her stall. It wasn't commanding or intrusive, just caring. I felt a strange warmth spread across my chest. The brief touch of her fingers, light yet reassuring, lingered longer than necessary, and I realized that I had been holding my breath. The market noises, distant chatter, the rustling of bags, the calls of the vendors, seemed to fade slightly, leaving only the quiet intimacy of that small moment. Her eyes met mine briefly, and there was something unspoken there, a recognition of mutual awareness, of shared presence. We continued walking together, though I didn't know if I should speak or remain silent. Every few steps, the rhythm of her movement behind me seemed almost protective, a quiet assurance that I wasn't alone. My heart raced in ways I couldn't quite name, excitement, curiosity, maybe even a subtle longing. I realized that, without a word, she had drawn me into her orbit, and the simple act of walking beside her now felt oddly grounding, comforting, and yet charged with the faintest hint of tension. By the time we reached the end of the market, I was acutely aware of every detail: the soft sway of her hair, the gentle cadence of her steps, the warmth of her presence in the sunlight. It was as if the world had slowed just enough for me to notice the quiet, deliberate grace of someone who didn't just occupy space, but subtly marked it, and me, with an unspoken, magnetic pull. By the time we reached a quieter side street just beyond the market, the initial tension between us had settled into something more delicate, a tentative curiosity, tempered with the subtle thrill of connection. I finally turned to her, unsure if I should speak, or if my words might break the fragile intimacy that had been silently building. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, calm and steady, with just a trace of amusement in the corners of her lips. It was an invitation, though unspoken, for me to bridge the space between observation and conversation. I swallowed, the lump of nervousness in my throat catching at first, then tried to speak casually. "I didn't expect anyone to watch out for me in the market," I said, hoping to sound nonchalant. She tilted her head slightly, a small smile playing across her face, and shrugged gently. "Sometimes it's nice to know someone notices," she replied, her voice warm but measured, carrying the kind of subtle humor that made it impossible not to listen closely. As we walked, the chatter of the market faded behind us. The scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the distant aroma of citrus and herbs. Each step beside her felt charged, not with urgency or desire, but with an unspoken intimacy that I was slowly learning to recognize. Her presence had a way of drawing my attention, not forcefully, but gently, like sunlight spilling into a quiet room. Our conversation began cautiously at first, about trivial matters, favorite stalls, the ripeness of tomatoes, the weather, but gradually, a deeper rhythm emerged. She spoke of her life with a quiet honesty, the kind that felt unpolished yet profoundly human. When she mentioned her late husband, there was a pause, a subtle shadow in her eyes, but her tone never wavered into bitterness. It was reflective, warm, and tinged with vulnerability. I noticed the way her fingers fidgeted briefly with the strap of her bag, a small gesture that revealed more than words ever could. There were moments when our hands brushed accidentally, reaching for the same jar of honey at a stall, or exchanging the bag of oranges she insisted I take. Each touch was brief, almost inconsequential, yet the warmth lingered on my skin, leaving a faint echo in my chest. My mind began to register more than just her appearance or voice. I noticed the subtle arch of her eyebrows when she laughed, the way her eyes softened when she spoke about something she cared for, the gentle tilt of her head as she listened. I realized, slowly, that this connection was unlike anything I had felt before. It wasn't explosive or urgent, it was quiet, grounding, and insistent in its own way. There was something magnetic in the calm confidence she exuded, in the way she allowed me to speak, to stumble over words without judgment, to be entirely myself. By the time we reached the end of the quiet street, I felt a strange reluctance to part ways. For the first time that afternoon, I recognized that the pull I'd felt in the market wasn't fleeting curiosity. It was the beginning of something that demanded attention, patience, and careful nurturing. I had no idea where this would lead, but in that moment, I wanted nothing more than to keep walking beside her, to continue unraveling the subtle, unspoken story that was slowly, insistently unfolding between us. We found a small cafe tucked into a quiet corner just beyond the edge of the market. Its wooden tables and mismatched chairs gave it an unpretentious charm, and the scent of freshly baked pastries mingled with the rich aroma of brewed coffee, creating a warmth that seemed to settle over us the moment we stepped inside. I felt a curious mixture of anticipation and nervousness as we chose a corner table, one that offered a little privacy without seeming deliberately secluded. Sitting across from her, I became acutely aware of every detail. The way she brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders as she leaned slightly forward, listening, the soft sound of her laughter when a waiter joked with another table. Everything about her was quiet, natural, unforced, yet magnetic. I found my gaze drifting repeatedly, drawn to the small gestures that revealed who she was beneath the surface: calm, a warmth, a careful attentiveness, a quiet strength tempered with vulnerability. We ordered tea, and as we waited, the space between us felt charged in a way words couldn't capture. The steam rising from our cups curled into the air, carrying with it the faint sweetness of the tea leaves, and I caught myself imagining her hand hovering near mine, a few inches too close to ignore. When our hands brushed slightly while reaching for sugar, a small shock ran through me, not of desire, but of recognition, of the silent language our bodies were beginning to develop. She noticed, too, though she didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of something unspoken, something both acknowledging and daring at once. The conversation continued, though the words felt secondary now. We spoke of trivialities, neighborhood gossip, the peculiarities of the market, but underneath each sentence, there was a rhythm building, a tension that was at once gentle and persistent. Every glance lingered slightly longer than expected. Every subtle lean forward, every casual brush of her hand against mine, carried a weight that made my chest tighten with unarticulated feeling. I noticed how her presence seemed to slow the world around us. The chatter of the cafe, the clink of cups and spoons, even the distant hum of traffic outside became background music to the quiet intimacy growing at our table. There was a rhythm to her breathing, a soft cadence I could almost synchronize with, and I realized that my own heartbeat had begun to match it, subtle and insistent. A particularly long pause fell between us as we reached for our cups simultaneously. Our fingers met again, brushing deliberately this time, and I felt the warmth spread from my hand up my arm. She held my gaze steadily, her expression calm yet deeply attentive, and I knew, without words, that she felt it too. There was no urgency, no expectation, only a shared acknowledgement of proximity, of connection, of something quietly profound blossoming in the space between us. When we finally spoke again, it was with softer voices, the kind that invite trust rather than command attention. Every smile, every slight tilt of her head, every lingering look became part of a silent conversation we were learning to have, a dialogue of glances, of subtle gestures, of emotions unspoken but deeply felt. By the time we rose to leave, I felt a strange reluctance to step back into the outside world. For the first time that day, I recognized that this wasn't merely a chance encounter. It was the beginning of something deliberate, slow, and quietly irresistible. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long, warm shadows across the market as we retraced our steps through its bustling aisles. The air was still filled with the familiar mix of aromas: freshly baked bread, the sharp tang of citrus, the earthy scent of herbs and vegetables, but now there was a soft, golden haze over everything, lending a quiet, almost cinematic beauty to the scene. I felt a growing sense of comfort walking beside her, an ease that came from the steady rhythm of our steps and the gentle cadence of her voice as we talked about nothing in particular. Then, in an instant, the calm fractured. A crate of tomatoes teetered precariously on the edge of a stall, nudged by an inattentive passerby. I moved to avoid it but misjudged the slickness of the cobblestones, my foot sliding just enough to throw off my balance. For a heartbeat, I felt the sharp pang of panic, a rush of adrenaline that made my chest tighten. And then, unexpectedly, her hand was on my arm. It was firm, steady, yet incredibly gentle, enough to anchor me without startling me further. "Careful," she said softly, her voice carrying a calm authority that somehow cut through the chaos around us. Her eyes, usually warm and observant, now held a flicker of alert concern, and I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and something deeper, a surge of emotion I couldn't quite name. We stood there for a moment, her hand still lightly resting on my arm, the warmth of her touch spreading slowly through me. The market noises, the calls of vendors, the laughter of children, the clatter of crates, seemed to fade into a distant hum. All I could focus on was the subtle steadiness of her presence, the way her gaze met mine with unspoken reassurance. I realized that I had never felt so unguarded in the midst of a crowd, so seen and protected by someone I had only met that afternoon. Once the immediate danger had passed, she gave my arm a light squeeze before releasing me, and a small, knowing smile curved her lips. "You should watch your step," she teased gently, though her eyes betrayed the lingering concern. I laughed, partly from relief, partly from the strange, thrilling awareness of how much that brief touch had affected me. Every nerve seemed to tingle, every breath carrying a subtle weight I hadn't expected. As we continued walking, I noticed the way she moved slightly closer, just enough to offer quiet support without intrusion. Her presence was comforting but charged, a subtle signal that she cared, not in a forceful or possessive way, but in the way someone truly attuned to another's needs would. I found myself watching her as much as the path ahead, noticing the graceful set of her shoulders, the delicate gestures of her hands as she adjusted the strap of her bag, the soft cadence of her steps that seemed to echo mine. By the time we reached a quieter corner of the market, I realized that this small crisis, so trivial in the grand scheme of the day, had shifted something between us. The protective instinct she had displayed, combined with the calm reassurance of her presence, had left an indelible mark. I felt a growing certainty that this connection, gentle yet persistent, was becoming something more than mere chance. There was trust now, a fragile but undeniable bond forming in the midst of the ordinary, a quiet intimacy that promised deeper emotional resonance in the moments yet to come. By the time we left the market behind, a soft haze had settled over the streets. The golden light of late afternoon bathed the sidewalks in warmth, and the distant hum of the city felt muted, almost gentle, as if the world had slowed just for us. We found a quiet bench beneath a tree whose leaves whispered softly in the breeze, and instinctively, we sat a little closer than necessary. There was no awkwardness, only a shared comfort in the presence of another human being who seemed to understand, even without words, the fragile rhythms of your heart. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small paper cup of tea she had picked up from the cafe earlier, offering it to me with a smile. Her fingers brushed mine briefly as I took it, and the warmth of her touch lingered longer than expected, sending a quiet thrill through me. I realized, with a slow clarity, that these small gestures, these fleeting touches, these gentle glances, were the language we were beginning to speak without needing to articulate it aloud. As we sipped our tea, the conversation naturally turned toward life, loss, and the things that weighed most heavily on the heart. She spoke of her late husband, of the quiet routines they had shared, of the laughter that still echoed in her memories. Her voice trembled ever so slightly at times, betraying the depth of her feeling, yet there was a strength in her words, a resilience that made me respect her even more. I found myself leaning in, captivated, wanting to understand her fully, to be trusted with the nuances of her story. I shared parts of myself too, my own struggles, my uncertainties, the small victories and defeats that had shaped me. For the first time in a long while, I felt that someone was truly listening, that my words mattered, not just superficially but in a way that resonated with another human soul. Her gaze never wavered, it held me, steady and unjudging, and I felt my usual defenses soften, dissolve even, in the quiet intimacy of that moment. Occasionally, our hands would brush, lightly, unintentionally, and I felt an electric warmth spread through me, a simple reminder of the physical closeness that had begun to accompany our emotional intimacy. She noticed, too, though she did not pull away. Instead, there was a subtle acknowledgement in the tilt of her head, in the softening of her eyes, in the gentle, almost imperceptible smile that curved her lips. Each time, it felt as though a silent understanding passed between us, a recognition that this connection was becoming something rare, something to be treasured. Time seemed suspended as we sat there, sharing stories, dreams, and quiet confessions. The air was tinged with the faint scent of the nearby market's herbs and flowers, and the breeze carried with it the warmth of sunlight fading toward evening. I realized that the age difference, which might have seemed significant to an outsider, was utterly irrelevant here. What mattered was the trust, the laughter, the comfort, and the gentle, insistent pull of two souls quietly finding each other. By the time we rose to leave, I felt a subtle ache at the thought of parting, a desire to prolong this rare intimacy just a little longer. There was no need for words. The promise was in the lingering glance, the softness in her smile, the warmth in the brush of her hand against mine. I understood then that this connection, slow, deliberate, quietly profound, was only beginning, and that the moments yet to come would carry the weight and beauty of a bond that neither of us would forget. The market was behind us now, the noise and bustle replaced by the quiet hum of the early evening. Golden sunlight stretched across the streets, softening the edges of buildings and casting long, warm shadows. I walked beside her, carrying a bag of groceries she had insisted we share, and I noticed, almost in disbelief, how natural it felt to be in step with her. The nervous tension from earlier had melted into a gentle rhythm, one where proximity no longer sparked anxiety but a quiet sense of ease. We didn't speak much at first. There was no need. The gentle brushing of our hands as we passed the bag between us, the occasional glance that lingered just a little too long, said more than words could. I noticed the curve of her smile when she caught my eyes, subtle but unmistakable, as if acknowledging that the connection we had been cultivating all afternoon was something rare, something worth cherishing. The air was filled with the scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery and the faint floral aroma drifting from a small garden tucked along the street. Every small detail, the warmth of the sun on her face, the sway of her hair in the evening breeze, the soft cadence of her steps, felt heightened, as though my senses had sharpened to every nuance of her presence. With each brush of her fingers against mine, each fleeting glance, I felt the pull of a connection deeper than anything I had expected to find in a market on an ordinary afternoon. We paused at a quiet street corner, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath around us. She looked at me, eyes steady and thoughtful, and I sensed a gentle reassurance in her gaze. There was no need for declarations or grand gestures. The intimacy between us had grown slowly, quietly, and it was enough to simply exist in that space together. Her smile, soft and knowing, hinted that she, too, recognized the rare nature of what had blossomed between us. As we resumed walking, our hands brushed once more, slightly longer this time, a lingering warmth that neither of us pulled away from. I felt an unexpected lightness in my chest, a quiet joy that came not from dramatic passion but from the simple comfort of being seen, acknowledged, and cherished. In that moment, I understood that this connection, nurtured patiently and gently, had the power to reshape the ordinary into something profoundly memorable. By the time we reached the edge of the street where our paths would soon diverge, a small, almost imperceptible hesitation passed between us. We didn't need to speak. The lingering touch of her hand, the warmth in her eyes, the slight tilt of her head toward me, all conveyed the unspoken promise that this was not the end. I would see her again. There would be more walks, more shared stories, more subtle touches and glances that spoke volumes. As I watched her walk ahead, the golden light catching her hair, I felt a quiet certainty. This was a beginning, a slow, deliberate, beautiful unfolding of something rare. And for the first time that day, I truly believed that a connection this gentle, this steady, and this profoundly human could last, and that the moments yet to come would carry the weight and beauty of everything we had started to discover together.